I think probably everybody knows. Lori and I spent a lot of time over the last year dealing with estate matters from my mom and from Lori's brother. And that prompted us to finally get around to doing our own wills and final arrangements and stuff. And you can't do that, I think, without spending some time pondering your legacy. I don't mean the financial legacy. I don't really care about that. I'm talking about the other definition of legacy, which is the long-lasting impact of particular events and actions, et cetera, that took place in the past, or the impact of a person's life. It seems like an appropriate topic to ponder a little bit in a Christian church, because let's face it, we are all a legacy of 2,000 years of trying to live in a particular way. So legacy is important to ponder. But for me, I often wonder if Jesus is actually happy with the way that we live out our interpretation of his legacy. I don't necessarily mean here, but I'm talking about society and the Christian church in general. And I think that's worth exploring a little bit from different perspectives. I'm going to ramble a little bit and loop back to that a little bit later on. So today is March 19th, which is 3 months to the day until our team of 22 heads off to Saugeen First Nation to spend a couple of days working on homes there. And aside from that, March is a really cool month for me because all of my overseas habitat builds have taken place in March. So I'm fairly active on social media. Facebook reminders come up every day for things that you've posted in the past, and my March is just full of memories of builds past. So March is a very cool month for me. March 19th in 2015 was build day 3 in Daan Bantayan on Cebu Island in the Philippines. We were working in an area that had been literally flattened by Typhoon Haiyan. And my blog post for that day went like this. We were filling in the floor area of several units with crushed stone. While strictly speaking not stone, it appeared to be crushed coral. The coral was in piles down the road. It was shoveled into 25-pound cement bags, then carried over to the units by hand and dumped. Hundreds of bags for each unit. At a rough calculation, we moved about 30 yards of stone, or about 3 dump truck loads, by hand. Part of the crew also tied rebar cages for the foundation excavations we had dug in the past few days. Another exhausting but very satisfying day. When I do my overseas builds, I write a blog, and the main intent of those is so that my family at home can actually follow along with the adventure. But they're also really useful for me to look back on and ponder and reflect. March 19th of 2016, me and one of my friends had just arrived in Delhi, India, after a full day of travel, and I mean a full day. We flew through the airspace of 11 countries, flew over the Atlantic Ocean, the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, which is really cool from the air, because you can actually recognize the Red Sea from the air. And the Indian Ocean. And so the next day would be our first trip out to the build site, which was in a slum outside of Delhi. Officially, it's a relocation community, but to our privileged eyes, it is very much, most assuredly, a slum. And then March 19th of 2017, we had just wrapped up our build in just outside of Joppa, Nepal. The team was back in Kathmandu, saying our goodbyes, and some going back to their homes, wherever that may be, some of us traveling onward. One group of us were headed up to NIagara. We were playing tourist for a wee bit. We were headed up to a place called, I kid you not, the Hotel at the End of the Universe, for a couple of days of sightseeing and hiking and watching the sunrise over the Himalayas, and reflecting and pondering a little bit what we had seen and done on the build. So that's some of the legacy that I take forward to our build in June. But the participants in that upcoming build are another really, really good lesson about the legacy that we create. There are a bunch of us from this church, which is quite commendable. We are, admittedly, a fairly senior congregation, but a number of us are actually going on the build, which is wonderful. And let's face it, as a Christian church, we should be doing that. Love thy neighbor as thyself. What better way is there than helping with accommodations on a build like this? One of my best friends is actually coming down to meet us on the build as well. He's coming down from Sudbury. That friend is actually one of the few really good parts of the legacy that I bring with me from my previous church. And I really clearly remember how that started. It was not too long before things started getting a little shaky there, and the minister brought up this young guy, my age, so young, and said, this is Bruce. His family went to this church when he was a child, and he and his wife have moved back into the area, and they are coming back to the church with their young daughter. And Bruce has some technical skills, so maybe he can help you out a little bit. And that turned out to be very much true. He helped me out considerably on the tech team there, and then he actually traveled with me a little bit when I first created NIagara Online Worship. He was part of that team. And since then, he's traveled with me with Habitat teams to both Nepal and to India. He joined me at Saugeen last year, and he's coming back to join the team again this year. There's a lot of dark memories from that previous church, but that's one friendship in particular that I claim as a positive legacy of my time there. The other, one of the other positives from that, I provided tech leadership there as I do here. And my tech team there, our rule was when the Sunday school kids got to a certain age, they could join the tech team. So that was sort of something to strive for. And one of, excuse me, sorry. One of my tech team is actually joining me on the build in June. So not only was he a legacy of build in the past, he's joining me now on a build as a grown man and bringing his girlfriend along, which is just sometimes I get to do stuff just because it's really cool. So my association with one of the other members joining us in June goes back to a legacy from that first build in the Philippines. Some of you might remember my story. I've told this one before here, I'm pretty sure. There was a day that 3 of us headed into the nearby village on one of the days off from the build. It's way outside my comfort zone to go and wander around and talk to strangers. But one of the guys on the team is really good at urging people to do things that are outside their comfort zone. And so 3 of us went in and wandered around, talked to the locals. Some of those interactions were absolutely magical, and it's amazing the connection that when you're open to that, the connection that you can make with people on the other side of the world that you're never going to see again, but can still make that connection. So had I not been on that particular trip, I would have never met Ken. And in the years since that build, he's the one who got me involved in Indigenous builds in Canada. And involved in learning a little bit more about our history with our Indigenous brethren in Canada and both the region and broader. I mean, that is a very dark history, and learning a little bit about that who lived here long before we white folk came and crashed the party is terribly important. Ken's the one whose family foundation actually brought us the 4 Seasons of Reconciliation course that a whole bunch of us did last year, and that a couple of people are going to do this year in preparation for the build. Ken's not a really churchy kind of guy, but his moral sense is something that a lot of so-called Christian folk could learn an awful lot from. He's coined a phrase that he uses to direct his charitable works and what he wants to do with his life. Instead of just giving away money, what he puts his effort into is doing things that contribute to what he refers to as the currency of kindness. If a few more people were interested in the currency of kindness instead of the currency that lines their pockets, what a difference that could make in the world. That truly is love thy neighbor as thyself in action. Some of you probably remember, certainly my family does, because some of them have been involved. For a number of years, I was involved in the planning and execution of the YWCA NIagara's signature event called No Fixed Address, which was created to raise funds and to raise awareness about the issue of homelessness in the region. That event actually is the first place I met Reverend Bill, because his previous church was a participant in the event. Well, the YWCA staff member who actually dreamed up that event is coming on my build in June. So really cool first full circle of moment for me to have her join my team this time. And then there's a couple of young guys that are friends of my daughter's, two brothers that have been around our family basically since high school. A couple of great young guys. In their younger days, one brother in particular spent a fair little bit of time around our place. And I feel like having them come along on this trip is hugely consequential. And I really hope that in years to come that they're going to look back on this build as the kind of life-altering experience that I look back on as mine. Be a really cool legacy to be able to claim that. When I started planning this build in June, I reached out to my former employer, because as I tell people as often as I possibly can, I'm retired. But unfortunately, none of my former colleagues actually were interested in joining up. But two former employees that I had worked with actually were interested. One young lady was a fellow founding member of the community support team that we created there. And when I reached out to see if she was interested in the build, she jumped at the chance. And if they can deal with childcare question, she's going to bring her husband along on the build as well, which would be great. And then the other former colleague that turned out to be interested is a young guy that he worked with me early in his career, fresh out of school basically, and up until the time I retired, he was still at Walters. He'd been working with us for a few years when he came to me for help, and he and his wife at that point wanted to do some traveling. They wanted to travel Asia and Europe for some months before they settled down. And in order to do that, he would have to quit, reapply to be hired when he got back, and of course he would lose the recognition of the time that he'd been there before he left. So of course I advocated for them to reconsider that policy, and we did. We recognized a leave of absence instead of him having to actually leave. Didn't cost me or the company anything to do that. It was just the right thing to do for a young guy, and they did their trip, created memories to last a lifetime, came home, settled down. They have two adorable freaking kids, just adorable. And when I reached out to see if if Anthony was interested in the build, again, he just jumped at the chance. The legacy we leave behind us in everyday life is just, it's very, rather humbling. So those are just a few of the people joining the team. Lots of others, but I don't have endless time here. Those are the people and how we are interconnected. Some are church people, some are not. But we're all connected by an interest in doing something truly valuable. Whether you think of that as the currency of kindness or think of that as loving our neighbors as ourselves, I don't care. It's still of infinite value in society. I always assume when I'm setting one of these up that people recognize why I choose to do my builds on June 19th and 20th. But just in case people don't realize why I do that, I should probably explain. June 21st, the day after our build, is Indigenous Peoples Day in Canada. So I wanted the build scheduled as close as possible to that date. The site closes down on the 21st, so the 19th to 20th was the best that I could do. And of course, as I mentioned before, the reason for wanting to do the build at that time is the legacy of our relationship with our Indigenous neighbors on this land we call Canada, which is in fact, or should be, a point of pain and sorrow for every one of us. So scheduling the build at that time of year is my act of reconciliation. Make no mistake, I think we live in the greatest of countries, but that is a blot on our history that we really do need to recognize. And more importantly, it's not just recognition. It should spur a desire to reach out and provide acts of reconciliation with those First Nation brethren. A reconciliation of action, not just words and feelings. So that's why I've been focusing on Indigenous builds in Canada the last few years, not looking overseas. Not that any one is any less important than the other. It just feels right to be putting the effort in close to home. And that need for reconciliation isn't just something personal, and it's not just something that we need to recognize as a country. It is very much something that we need to recognize as a church. The legacy of the residential school debacle in North America is something that should haunt every one of us. And let's face it, the United Church of Canada did have a hand in that. Admittedly, we were not the worst offenders. And we were, in fact, the first to issue a formal apology for our part in that history. And we have spent years actively seeking reconciliation. But the truth is that none of that really holds us blameless. And that's not just a Canadian thing. It's long been a broader Christian attitudinal thing. I said earlier, I wondered if Jesus is happy with the way that we live out our interpretation of his legacy. Think about things like the doctrine of discovery, that long asserted that lands belonged to the Christian powers that discovered them. Much like Christopher Columbus discovered the New World. How do you discover someplace where there are tens of millions of people living in thriving communities before you got there? By most accounts, there would have been 60 million Indigenous peoples in North America in 1492. Between diseases and colonial forces, that would have dropped to about 6 million a century later. But even if it had only been 6 million when Columbus landed, how do you say that he and other explorers of that era discovered this land? You hear a lot of the same kind of Christian superiority rubbish from a lot of what I refer to as so-called preachers. I'd love to be able to say that it's more prevalent in the States, that we just see it up here on social media and the news, but that's not really true. I've heard some pretty hateful ideology espoused by Christians everywhere. I think one of the worst things I have ever heard a human being say was in a study group at Lundy's Lane when we were talking about the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, where 230,000 people died. And one of our so-called Christians said it was because the people in the destroyed areas were Hindu and Muslim. If it had been Christian countries, the death toll wouldn't have been so high. As if, because the people that lived there weren't Christian, they weren't worthy of God's protection. How Jesus must have wept when he heard that spewed by somebody supposedly following his teachings. Lighten that one up a little bit. My mom always loved that famous picture of the laughing Christ. You know that one, the one I mean? She always said that he must have been fun to be around, because how else would he have drawn together that motley crew of ordinary people that became his disciples and that carried on the legacy of his stories and teachings? So that picture was a favorite, but I have to feel like there's a lot of times when it should be tears, not that laughter, when his teachings are twisted to justify hate and misogyny and war and genocide. So yeah, the some of that is kind of dark, and I really don't like to do that, but needed to be said. But we're going to lighten up for a couple more stories to cap this off. There was an older lady on our builds in India and Nepal. When I organized the build at Saugeen last year, she reached out and asked if she could donate to the build. She feels like she's gotten a little bit past the age where she can actually come out and build, but she still wanted to support the cause. Last year I had to tell her no, because I wanted to sponsor the build from my inheritance from my mom. But this year, when I said I was going again, she was the very first one outside of the group to jump in and donate. So that, again, is a legacy of builds shared and work shared for a truly great cause, and she's never lost sight of wanting to help with that, even though she can't physically help. My last story is this one. One of the guys who was with me on all three of my overseas builds from out west, the first day of the first build, we were sitting around the table getting acquainted. When it came his turn to tell us why he was actually there, he pointed at his wife and said, "She told me I was coming." Well, in spite of that joking start, every day of every build, he was out there giving it his best effort. And he's way bigger than me, so he's about 2.5 times the size of the locals. So him putting in his best effort counted for a lot. So back home in Alberta, I know that even at that time, he was volunteering a lot with search and rescue. But, excuse me, sorry. I just recently saw an announcement that he's now president of the board of directors for Grand Prairie Technical Search and Rescue Association. How cool is that? How many of us are willing to literally put our butts on the line and go out without fanfare and do something that important voluntarily? How much better can you live the commandment to take care of others? I don't know. I'm in awe of what people like that and his team and others like them do. And I'm very proud of that friend. We in this room all claim as our legacy the teachings of Christ. May we authentically live those teachings. May we truly love our neighbors as ourselves. May we do unto others as we would have them do unto us. And may what we spend on those we encounter be the currency of kindness. Thanks always be to God for everything we are, everything we have, and everything we have to give